but just beware when you're buying something this inexpensive, there might be something wrong with it. So everything has power, wipers worked and everything. So I was cycling the key back and forth and I finally figured out that I had installed the fuel pump backwards.
Okay, let me see. Oh, what is that?
I think it's
Broken?
broken. The fuel rails are literally held on with like some exhaust hangers and stuff. All right, here goes nothing, I guess. Keep an eye on the oil pressure gauge. So I have good and bad news. Welcome back to another episode of Rosto-Mod. A few weeks ago, we just had our Patina party car show, and we're just kind of recovering from that. We had a lot of stuff going on, but we are back in the shop, and we are going to try to keep working on our Buick Skylark. If you guys aren't familiar with this build, basically we are trying to make a budget boosted car. So we got this thing out of a junkyard for 200 bucks. We ended up getting it running and driving, but unfortunately the carburetor overfilled and it actually ended up catching on fire. So we decided to buy a cheap Silverado for a few hundred bucks, yank the motor and transmission out of it, part out the Silverado, and use the money from the part out to fund a cam and twin turbos. So we're going to try to do this thing really budget and try to boost this thing for as low cost as possible. So in the last episode, you saw that we actually got the entire wiring harness and we're trying to get this thing wrapped up. So let's start picking away at the few last things we have to do on this car so we can try to get one step closer to turning this thing on and firing it up. If you guys remember on the last episode, I brought this to the big shop and we ended up wiring pretty much everything on the engine. We do have a few more things to knock out on this before we can actually start it, but we are very close. We ended up putting a $80 eBay harness on this and we're using the stock computer that came out of the Silverado. We did send the computer off to get VATs deleted and a base tune on it, so hopefully this thing will run pretty decently whenever we try to fire it up, but we still have a few more things to tackle on the engine side so we can get this thing very close to being able to start. I did see a few comments talking about the harness and some bad experiences some guys have had with a cheap harness like this where things were just wired incorrectly and other stuff. So hopefully we don't have those problems, but just beware when you're buying something this inexpensive, there might be something wrong with it. So before you go and route it all throughout your car, check everything. We kind of went through it a little bit and it seems like everything's in the right spot, but we're gonna find out whenever we try to start this thing. So hopefully it's all good, but let's try to get this thing ready to go in case we do have a problem with the wiring harness. The O2 sensors are not in the exhaust. I'm going to have to weld a bung on the exhaust on both sides. The reason I haven't done that yet is because this exhaust is pretty good. I'm happy with the way that it was, but this exhaust I'm not happy with, and I've been kind of putting it off trying to redo this. I just don't have a lot of pipe left over, so I'm gonna have to end up redoing this side because of the clearance with the tire and the booster. But I think for now, if we could try to just get the thing running, at least it'll give me some motivation to try to redo that. Some of the sensors I still need to finish up. My temperature sensor down here works, but the fitting is wrong. So that's not gonna work, it's just gonna leak everywhere. I'm gonna have to figure out what to do with that. The oil pressure sensor is there, but I'm going to have to run a line into the cab so I can make that work. If you guys remember, this harness actually didn't have a plug for the oil pressure sensor on it, so just keep that in mind if you guys are doing this kind of thing. But I'm gonna run a manual gauge inside the car, so I'm gonna have to hook that up. I haven't had time to make the lines going down to the timing cover yet, so that's gonna be one of the first things that we're gonna have to knock out. And I wanna go through and check all the fuel lines and everything before we start it, because I probably hand tightened some of them because I was trying to figure it out and just never got back to tightening them up. So I want to just go through everything, make sure everything's tightened up, and we should be good. So that's pretty much all we have left. So let's try to knock out these last few things and see how far we can get on this. First thing I'm going to tackle are the turbo drain lines. If you can see, our turbo's up there and we need to go all the way to here on each side for our timing cover to accept the drain on the turbo. So I'm going to disconnect these AN lines, route them in a way where they don't interfere with the belt, try to get them as far back as I can, but you also don't want them to be at an angle where it's hard to drain. You want these to drain very freely. So a nice gradual swoop down and then into our timing cover. So I'm gonna yank these off real quick and make these turbo drains. This one is really tight in between our accessories, so hopefully that's not a problem, but they shouldn't go too bad. So let me yank this stuff off real quick, make these lines, and we can check that off the list. All right, if you can see up here, the turbo drain lines are done. This one is really hard to tighten because of where our brackets are. So I'm gonna have to get a smaller wrench to tighten that one up, but they are connected up top here to the turbos, go all the way down into our timing cover. So that's knocked off the list. Just gotta tighten that one fitting up and we can move on to the next thing. All right, so now that I got the turbo drains in there, I'm going to crawl underneath here and just check every fuel line, make sure everything's tight. I bought a battery tray that I'm going to install back here, and then my battery can be mounted and we can throw a battery in this thing. Since we have it up in the air, I'm gonna throw this in real quick and then we can have a place to mount our battery, and then we can lower it down, finish everything up top, and see if this thing will turn over. All right, so since I don't have an oil pressure sensor, I bought this fitting you can see down there in place of the oil pressure sensor that's stock on the motor. So what I'm gonna do is actually hook this up to a mechanical oil pressure gauge. So I'm gonna screw this down onto that fitting right there, and I'm gonna run that line into where we have all of our connectors in the firewall and hook that up to my oil pressure gauge inside the car. All right, so I got my line ran up into here and then into my gauge. I don't know if I showed this in the last video, but I took the vent out and put our gauges here. I'm gonna have to put some screws in it to mount it down, but it fits perfect. So that's in there. At least we have oil pressure, and hopefully the temperature gauge will work. I still have to mess with that fitting, but for now, we at least got oil pressure to make sure this thing is making some kind of oil pressure. I'm gonna throw some oil in it now. Hopefully we can crank it over and try to build some oil pressure. We're getting pretty close. The next step that we have to do is we're going to mount our O2 sensors. So I'm gonna drill 2 holes in each side and then just tack these on real quick. And O2 sensors should be mounted until I re-weld that side. All right, guys, I got oil in it and we have everything tightened down. I forgot to tighten down the turbo housing, so went ahead and did that. Hopefully connect the battery and this thing doesn't burn to the ground. So we are getting really close, guys. I'm getting pretty excited. This project has been kind of an on and off thing, but I'm really looking forward to hearing this thing running. Hopefully everything goes well. You never know. 400,000 mile junkyard LS, max speeding rod turbos, which are very inexpensive, and a bunch of eBay and Amazon parts to try to make this thing work. The cam is literally $200 and the valve spring. So anything could happen. So let's see what happens here.
Day 2.
So I threw the battery in the back and hooked it up, clicked the key, nothing, no power to the rest of the car. So I'm trying to figure out what the heck that is. So I think I've finally figured out what the problem is. So I'm getting 12 volts down to the starter, and there's 2 wires coming off of the starter. One of them runs up here to the alternator, and one of them runs inside to power everything else, like the fuse panel and stuff that this harness comes with. So what I did was I just jumped the starter power wire to the alternator. So I put an alligator clip on it just to test it to see if that was it. And I hooked that up. And then I'm finally getting power to the rest of the car. So you can see I turned the headlights on. So the headlights come on and I'm actually getting power, which is good. So that was, I think, my problem. I'm gonna just try to crank it. Oh, windshield wipers are on. Fuel pump came on, so that's good. How do I turn the windshield wipers off? Oh, the radio turned on. How do I turn these wipers off? 1 second. Okay, so everything has power. Wipers worked and everything. So let's try to crank it and see what happens here. Let me turn the headlights back off. Cranking it, it does crank. Didn't see any oil pressure over there. So good, it cranks just with that little alligator clip. I'm gonna have to just run another wire up to this because this is way too small, but it's good just to test it. Now that it at least cranks, I'm gonna try to throw some fuel in the tank just a little bit to see if this thing will fire off. So that's the next step. But first, I'm gonna try to run this wire a little bit better. That way I can get something that's kind of semi-permanent. All right, I threw some gas in there, hooked the battery up. I still got it up in the air because I want to check for leaks. So let me just turn the fuel pump on and see if we got any leaks. Usually there's a few. Doesn't sound like our fuel pump's picking up any fuel yet. I'm gonna cycle the key a few times and check.
Much later.
All right, guys, it's been a little bit of me going back and forth on the Buick, trying to figure out all the stuff that works, but I ended up getting the fuel pump figured out. So I was cycling the key back and forth, and I finally figured out that I had installed the fuel pump backwards. So I went ahead and pulled the fuel pump back out, flipped it around, put it back in, and we get fuel pressure. I have no idea why I thought it was the other way. I've installed this fuel pump before, and I just completely oversaw that it was actually backwards. So that made a big difference. So now the fuel pump's in the right way and we're getting fuel pressure up to the rail. But if you guys have ever installed fuel rails on an aftermarket intake, you know that the brackets that they usually come with, which this one looks like someone homemade, are not the best. So what was happening was we're getting fuel pressure, but it was leaking out right where the injectors are sealing. So the rails were not completely sealed down on the O-rings on the injectors. So I'm going to have to remake these brackets so the fuel rails can be bolted down properly. And then hopefully we should have good fuel pressure and we can try to start this.
6.5 hours later.
The fuel rails that I have on here, if you guys remember, I bought this from a buddy of mine for $100. And the way that the fuel rails were mounted onto there was not the greatest way to do it. The fuel rails are literally held on with like some exhaust hangers and stuff that someone had cut up to be able to make it work. But I got it to fit kind of. I mean, it doesn't leak. It was just this side was spraying like crazy, and then you would adjust something and it would get a little better, and then one side would spray, and it was just a mess. So honestly, I think I'm just gonna get rid of these fuel rails and go to something a little bit better. I do have these Holly ones from the Rambler. Problem is I don't have the right fittings to go on there, and I really just want to try to see if this thing will run. So I think I might have gotten it. I'm gonna try to turn the key on. Hopefully it doesn't leak so we could try to see if this thing will start. All right, here goes nothing, I guess. Keep an eye on the oil pressure gauge. Oh, it's fired up. Something's smoking bad. Hey, it ran for a second. All right, well, it starts and then it immediately dies. So I think that's either one of two things. Either I have the wire hooked up wrong to the crank and it's losing signal once I let off the key, or the VATS is still on the computer, which I kind of doubt because I already sent the computer out. So I'm gonna check the wiring real quick. Maybe I screwed something up with that, and I'll get back to you guys. So I have good and bad news. The good news is all the wiring seems to be working. The Buick makes oil pressure. The turbos are spinning. We don't have any more fuel leaking, which is really good. And all the fuel pump and all that stuff seems to be working good. The bad news is whenever you turn the key to fire it fires up for like 2 seconds, makes great fuel pressure, and it just stops running. So I've checked all the wiring, I've checked everything that I can think to check, and it still does the same thing. My theory is at the moment that the VATS in the computer is still active. Now I've done some research trying to figure out what is going on, and apparently if the VATS is still active on the car, you can turn the key, fire it up, and then it'll just shut off immediately. It's like the computer's telling the injectors not to fire. So I think that's the problem. So good news is tomorrow my buddy has HP tuners. He's gonna plug into it and make sure that the VATS is disabled, because if it isn't, then that's our problem. If it's not, then it's something else. I'm used to using the Holley Terminator stuff, and I've only done the stock computer stuff once, and it went pretty smooth whenever I did it originally in the Rambler. Hopefully we can get this issue figured out, and I'll take you guys along to show you what happened. If this is happening on your swap, maybe this will help you out too. So hopefully the VATS is still enabled, but we're gonna have to find out tomorrow to see if that's really the problem.
Day 3.
Would you like to introduce yourself?
What's up? I'm Brian.
We were thinking that it was the VATS, and ended up the VATS is off, so that's good. At least I didn't waste my money sending the computer off. So ended up, Brian has HP tuners, so we went through the computer to see what was kind of the problem, and ended up our MAF sensor was scaled wrong, because I actually have a turbo MAF sensor, it's a 3-bar in there instead of the stock one. And our throttle position sensor is reading higher than 0 when your foot's not on the gas. So I'm gonna unplug it. We're gonna try to modify it a little bit so that it can read 0, and we'll try to fire it up. So hopefully that's our problem.
Okay, let me see. Oh, what is that?
I think it's
Broken?
broken.
You saw it here first, guys.
Here, Brian, what does it read?
Does this have a throttle position sensor on that throttle body? This is the whole throttle body, and I see.
Oh, maybe.
Just take it's not bolted on. Dude, we just robbed a parts off of.
Fuck, that's heavy.
Does that one?
No, it's fucking.
Ah, it's
Dang
gone.
it.
Dang it.
Damn.
Might have used it on the Rambler's new intake.
Wait, that was the one that was on there because you got the green in it. No shit.
Yeah.
Go what?
Well, at least we're making progress.
Dang. Keep going, or?
Yeah. Try it again. I'm just.
You see the voltage on there?
Voltage makes things wig out too.
Yeah. Let me grab it under that.
Probably.
It's running! Let's go! Let's go! All right, finally, this thing is running. So, big thanks to Brian, big thanks to Pat. Thank you, because I would have never figured this out. So it wasn't actually the VATS. What happened was, I guess kind of a combination of things, but what the main reason of why it wasn't staying running whenever you would turn the key is the tune was way off in the ECU. So I had sent the ECU out to get it tuned, and they said that it was a startup tune, and it started up, but it just didn't run after the startup tune.
So I don't know if they use that as a, it starts and then it dies, so you email them and then they'll send you another tune.
Yeah. So Brian is messing with the tune and we got it pretty close. So at least it's running. That's all I really was concerned with. Make sure it has oil pressure, everything like that. And we still have a ways to go to finish it up. So he's figuring that out. The other issue we had was the throttle position sensor ended up being broken. I'm gonna have to get another one of those, but this is stuff that we learn while we're building these things. So haven't really done much with HB tuners yet, mostly all Holley stuff. So it's a little bit of a learning curve for me, but it's pretty cool to figure out how all this stuff works. So we're gonna try to clean up the tune a little bit more, at least so I can get the thing running enough. So that way, whenever I put the drive shaft in and all the coolant stuff, it'll idle.
Either I put way too much and it won't start, or it'll still be too much.
Rev limiter.
All right, guys. Well, big shout out to Brian and Pat for helping me out with the Buick. We did get it fired up for the first time and it ran pretty good. After that video, if you've seen the next clip, we tried to fire it up and it literally went all the way to rev limiter and just started bouncing off the rev limiter, so shut it off. And I'm not really sure what happened because we have the throttle position sensor unhooked and just set at 0 since the sensor ended up being broken, and we had the throttle completely shut. So there's really no reason why the car should have went all the way straight to rev limiter just out of the whim. So I'm thinking it could be something with the intake, so we're gonna pull the intake off. I really want to change those fuel rails anyway. It's gonna be a lot easier to do that with the intake off. So we're gonna try to pull the intake off in a little bit and try to just see how everything is. But on the bright side, it did fire up, it did run, and it did idle. So I'm really happy with that. We know our engine's healthy and it at least runs. So I think that's gonna do it for this episode, guys. We got the Buick finally running. I know this has kind of been an on and off project, but it's a big step. So make sure you guys like, comment, subscribe so you can stay up to date with all the episodes we have here on Rusted Mod. We have some really big things coming up soon, and check out more episodes on the Buick. Thanks for watching, guys. We'll see you in the next episode.